Hey everyone, my name is Riley, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can set up and host your podcast on Kajabi. Whether you are brand new to podcasting and you want to start your podcast using Kajabi, or whether you already have a podcast and you want to take your existing podcast and now host this on Kajabi, whichever of these categories you fit into, I'm going to show you how you can not only create or import your podcast, but how you can actually take your podcast that is hosted on Kajabi and put your podcast on platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you do not yet have a Kajabi account, I will leave my affiliate link in the description of this video, and using that link will allow you to get an extended 30-day free trial of Kajabi as opposed to the regular 14-day trial that Kajabi offers you. Now, to get started with hosting and creating your podcast, I created a brand new Kajabi account right here. All we need to do is go over to products on this left-hand side. So we click on this drop-down menu, and then from here we can see the podcasts option. So let's go ahead and click into this right here. And then you can see we can get started with creating a new podcast by just clicking on this button right here. Now, we essentially have two options. You can either import a podcast or you can create a new podcast. Now, if you are specifically looking to import a podcast from a new platform, then what I would recommend doing is use the timestamps in the description to skip along to the import a podcast section. But if you are starting a new podcast, then we just want to start right here and click on create a new podcast. We can click on continue. And then in here, we can now go through and enter in some information. So we can start out with the title of this podcast. We can just enter this in right here. I'm going to call this the GeForce Cast. Then we can enter in the host name, so who you are as the podcast host. We can enter that in. And then we can also create a brief description of this podcast. So we can enter that in right there. And then right here, we can see we have podcast availability. So we have public and we have private. So public is usually what 99% of people are going to be going for. If this is just a regular podcast that you want to put on Apple, on Spotify, on any of these other platforms. And then private is going to be if you want to lock this behind a paywall and get people to pay for your podcast. So we are just going to go for public right here. And then we can click on continue. We can then go in here and choose the podcast language. So whichever language your podcast is in, we can select this right here. I'm going to go for English. And then we can select the podcast category. So what you will notice is we have the overall podcast category, and then we have some subcategories within this. So we have arts, and then the subcategory is books. Arts, subcategory design. So we just want to go down and choose this. And for me, I'm going to go for business and entrepreneurship. I think this is a good fit for my podcast. So I'm going to select that right there. And keep in mind that this is super important because when we are sharing this to Spotify or Apple Music, this is what your podcast is going to be branded under. So we need to make sure that is correct. We can then choose if you want to list the podcast in episodic order. So this is going to be most podcasts where the newest shows at the top. And then we just go down and each podcast comes after the other, each episode. And then we have serial order. So this is if you have different seasons throughout your podcast. You might have season 1, and then it's going to list all of the episodes in season 1. Then season 2, list all of the episodes. So depending on the way that you have your podcast set out, we can select this right here. Then we click on continue, and we can choose a primary and accent color that is going to apply to Kajabi. Now, this is only specifically going to apply when you send people to the podcast page on Kajabi. This is not going to apply if somebody goes to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, for example. This is going to have no effect. But if you are linking somebody straight over to your podcast page on Kajabi, this is the only place it's going to take effect. But either way, I might set this to maybe like a blue color right here. And then we can have the accent color as maybe a darker blue, my brand colors. Maybe this is a little bit too much. Maybe something like that is better. And then this is super important. We want to create or set up a podcast image. Now, the reason that this is super important is because if I go over to Spotify right here, for example, we can see these are all of the podcast thumbnails. And whatever you set here, this is what's going to show up in this area. So it's very important that we get this right. We need a nice podcast thumbnail, right? Now, the best way to create this, if you don't already have one, is through this website right here called Canva. This is one that I created in literally like 2 minutes. So I will leave a link to Canva in the description. You can essentially go to Canva right here, create a design in this top right corner, and then we want to search for podcast. We can just select this. And then in the podcast area, we can come up here and search for some templates. So let's say that this podcast is maybe about like true crime. We could type that in right here. And then look at this. We have all of these beautiful templates that we can use. So if my podcast was about true crime, I could maybe come in here and just change this text to say GeForce Cast, which is the name of my podcast. And then we would maybe go in here and make the text a little bit smaller so that this actually fits in. Let's try 350. Okay, perfect. Then we can like rearrange this. If you want to add any other elements to this, you can do this on this side right here. So we could add maybe like a handcuffs. If we wanted to, we could add them in, and then we just drop them in this area, change the color. You get the idea. This is how we can create the podcast thumbnail. Then we can go back over and we just drop it in right here. So we can click on upload an image and then browse files. Then I'm just going to grab the podcast thumbnail that I created earlier, and we can drop this in and upload. And beautiful. That is now in there just like that. Then looking at this, I might go up and change some of these colors right here. So I have like, this is a blue. That looks a lot better. So you can just play around with this, make sure this matches, and then we can go save and finish. And in here, we now have the brass tacks, the kind of podcast outline created. So if we just click back here into podcasts, we can see the GeForce Cast is right here. And then if we want to create a new podcast, we can really create as many podcasts as we like. And if we click back in, right here, this is where we can actually upload the episodes of our podcast. So we would just click in right here to new episode. And in here, we can create an episode title. So I'll just call this episode 1. Welcome to the pod. Then we can choose the type, if this is an episode, if this is a bonus, or this is a trailer. So I'm going to keep this as an episode. And then if you did use the seasonal kind of layout when we were creating this podcast, we can add a season right here. So we can have like season 1, we can create season 2, so on and so forth. But I'm going to set this to no season. We can then go down here and add a description or show note in this section. So we can say what this podcast is about. And then down here at the bottom, this is where we can upload the audio. Now look at this. This is going to allow a maximum file size of 250 megabytes for MP3. So what this means is you can record hour-long podcasts in awesome audio quality, and all of this you will be able to upload to Kajabi. So it's not like you're going to be cut off after like half an hour or an hour. As I said, 250 megabytes for an MP3 file. And all we would do is click on upload audio right here, browse files, and then select the audio file, and we can add that in right there. And then down here, you can also choose if this episode contains explicit content. The reason this is important is for Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it's going to have that little E next to it, so you should really check this off if this is an explicit episode. Then we can go down and just add this in right here. And then as we can see, we have episode 1, welcome to the pod. That is now in. And then we have the status. So the status right now is set to unscheduled, but we can go over and we can go to edit details. And in here, I should be able to publish this. I think the reason is because I didn't actually upload anything here. So let me just see if I have an MP3 file. We can upload this, and you can see this is going to drop in. So we could go through and listen to this. We can also add an episode thumbnail. We can add transcription if we want to. But most importantly, we can now go up to schedule episode, and we can choose when we want to release this. So today's date is the 21st. Let's say we want to release this tomorrow at, let's say 6 p.m. We could set that right there. And now that's going to be scheduled for 6 p.m. tomorrow. So we just save, and that podcast is now ready to go. Now, if we back out, here is how we can actually link this to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, to all of these other options. So we want to click into the podcast right here, and then go up to distribution at the top. And then once we are in the distribution area right here, we can see we have Apple Podcasts and we have Spotify. So to link this to Apple Podcasts, we just want to click in. And then if you need help doing this, if you need help finding your Apple Podcast URL, we just click into here to learn how, and it's going to walk us step by step through exactly how to do this. So what we would do is copy the RSS feed URL, which is this link right here, paste this URL into Apple Podcast Connect. So we just open this up. You can log into your Apple Podcast Connect account, and then you would just paste it into the URL field. And that's it. Then it's going to be linked to Apple Podcasts. Same for Spotify. We just go down right here, copy the URL feed, open Spotify for podcasters, go in and do all of this. And then once we have that set up, your podcast will be available on both Apple and Spotify. Some of the other things that we can do is we can just view the analytics in this area. So we can see the total downloads, we can see the apps. So if most listens are coming from Spotify or Apple, we can see the devices, the device operating system, the top country, the top 10 episodes. We can see all of these statistics in here. Now, if you instead want to import a podcast, we can import your existing podcast by going to this area. So import a podcast and then continue. And then we just need to grab the RSS feed link. This is going to be slightly different for whichever podcast platform you are already hosting on. But as an example with Buzzsprout, which is one of the most popular, all we would do is go over here to podcast info. Then we can go to RSS feed. And this is the public RSS feed link right here. So we just copy the link. With most podcast platforms, this should be super easy to find. But if not, you can just go to Google and type this in. So like how to find RSS feed link for Buzzsprout. We would just enter that in, and then it's going to show you exactly how to find this. But what you would do is just copy the link right here, then paste this into Kajabi. We can click on continue. And just like that, the episode is going to be imported. So it's essentially going to go to whichever platform you had this hosted on. It's going to import the title, the host, the description, all of the episodes, including all of the MP3 files. It's going to get everything and bring them over to Kajabi. The only one thing that it won't import is your statistics. So the downloads that you have, the top episodes, essentially all of your stats are going to be lost. That's the only downside. But either way, once we have imported this, we can just click on save and finish. And it's going to go ahead and import this. So it might take a few minutes. Obviously, the more podcast episodes you have, the longer it's going to take. But honestly, at this point, you can just open a new tab. As long as this tab is open at the background, you can just go and do something else whilst this imports. And then once your podcast is imported, to get this onto Apple Music and Spotify, we do this in the exact same way, where we just go up to distribution right here. For Apple Podcasts, we just go in and paste the Apple Podcast URL. And if you don't know how to find this, we just go up, paste the feed in right here, and go to Apple Podcast Connect. Take this link and just paste that in, and then that will put your podcast on Apple Podcasts. Same with Spotify, we just go in right here, learn how, paste this link, go to Spotify for podcasters, and paste that in right there. So that is how you can create and host your podcast on Kajabi. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to smash that like button and tap that subscribe button. And until next time, take it easy.